Okay, what I want to talk about in this video is some of the basic uh, questions which have plagued or psychologists have been dealing with since the beginning of history of psychology until today. Obviously, there are differences in ways that the ways that they've dealt with these questions. The breadth of them and the depth of them have changed over the course of time, as well as some of the basic paradigms of looking at it. But these questions remain until today in some way, shape, manner, form, the basic questions, the basic axes of exploration in psychology. The first one we want to talk about is the question of nature versus nurture. Okay, this is a question which people seem to think about all the time, almost naturally. Well, is this really aggressive? Is this person naturally happy, or is it just is that he's been lives a good life? Can I be happier? Right? Can I be less depressed? Can I be push myself to be more aggressive or more passive? That would mean it would be a nurture. Nature means that there is a inborn quality which cannot be changed. Nurture means that it comes from the outside. There's an environmental effect. So how do we know that people are different? What accounts for the differences between people? Right? Now, in truth, we know today that there is no clear-cut definition. Nothing in human behavior, nothing in human experience is 100% genetic or 100% environmental. Well, not exactly nothing. Eye color is genetic. But when we talk about behavior and psychological and social stuff, nothing is 100%. So the question which remains is not whether it is nature versus nurture. The question is how much of the variability in a particular characteristic is attributable to heritability. That's a very important word, by the way. To heritability. What does that mean? In other words, how much is given through the genes? How much can we experimentally determine is dependent on genetic input, and how much is on environmental input? We have these things in medical stuff all the time. When you talk about high blood pressure or high cholesterol, some has to do with genetics and some the family, etc., and some has to do with how much you're eating, right? So it might be genetic, it might be, but there's some things which for instance, intelligence. How much is intelligence, right? Genetic, and how much intelligence can we bring it up, make it higher? Of course, there's a question of what is intelligence, but in most, we can say that there's a very high heritability ratio when you talk about intelligence, right? It comes about between 85% of intelligence is heritable. Now, on the other hand, when you take a different type of characteristic like extroversion, the tendency to be social, that's only about 50% heritable. Right? In other words, there's some sort of contribution from from genes, but social aspects will have a really, really important impact. Happiness is about 60% attributable to input natural tendencies. 40%, right? 40% is environmental. You can affect it 40%. Well, we'll have to talk a little about statistics, what that actually means. Okay, that's question number one. Question number two. Free will versus determinism. How much, most Americans believe in free will. This has been a question which has been plaguing psychologists from the beginning. One school of psychology which we have talked about and we will talk about extensively is the school called behaviorism. The B.F. Skinner, who was the greatest proponent and champion of behavioral psychology, did not believe in free will at all. He didn't believe it existed. Now, on the other hand, humanistic psychology believes that free will is the basis of behavior. So the big question, how much do we actually choose what we're doing? How much is it a question of we're forced by either inner determinations, inner anxieties, such as the Freudian idea and the psychodynamic ideas that we behave because of need to release anxiety, right? Or are there some other things? Now, in effect, when we look at in the textbook that we're using in our class, and many other textbooks also, especially in psychology today, when we're talking about a biological and a neurological expertise and going into depth of the fashion and the scientific fashion today is to go into depth to the neurological and the brain studies, we actually are beginning to see a tendency in psychology to say that free will is not as prevalent and not as strong as determinism. And as a matter of fact, there are studies where they can look at functional MRI, ask a subject a question while he's in the functional MRI machine, and the scientists who are watching what's going on in the person's brain can say what the person will decide sometime prior to the actual decision-making process. Now that sounds like if I'm going to decide something and you can tell me what I'm going to decide, then there's no free will. It's determined beforehand. It's determined by the biology. And that seems to be where psychological research is going today, or neuropsychological research. But that's not so clear. Because even today, even with these things, the answer is that many other disciplines will say, wait a minute, that's not a question for psychology. So the neuropsychological might be saying such a thing, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. It means that this particular evidence, and this is of course true with any sort of science. So that's question number 2. I mean, we need to believe in free will for society to function the way it's been functioning since time immemorial. Why do I say such a thing? Because our legal system is based on the idea of crime and punishment. And somebody has to be responsible for his actions and made a choice in order to be punished. So it's not such a simple thing to say that there is no free will. Okay. The third question, completely different idea, is the question of accuracy. How accurate is our whatever it is, right? For instance, how accurate are our perceptions? Do two people perceive things differently? So then which one is right? Which one's more accurate? Which one's further away from the objective truth? Or our memories. How much are our memories fixed? When we look at memory, we'll see that we used to think of memory as sort of like putting data into onto a tape, onto a video, and that it's stuck there in our brains and it doesn't change, sort of like the memory in a computer. Is that true? Well, we find out that it's not. Our memory is not like a computer memory. It's more like a wiki memory, as like in Wikipedia or in some sort of wiki, W-I-K-I. In other words, it can change dynamically with the input and the output and the interactions and many factors. So the question of how accurate is our memory, how accurate is our perceptions, how is it affected by our motivations, how is it affected by our emotions, how is it affected by passing. This is another major question which psychologists must deal with. Another major question is how much are we aware of the actual processes which are going on. In other words, the question of conscious versus unconscious processing, right? In other words, when I do make a decision, regardless of whether it's free will or determined or whatever it is, how much input is there which goes only according to what I know that I'm thinking? And how much is it going from something deep down inside, either deep down inside emotionally or deep down inside cognitively? Where is the determination coming from, right? Again, Freudian says that our behaviors are determined primarily by unconscious processes. The neuropsychological perspective, which I discussed a minute ago, says it's primarily unconscious processes, that 90% of what goes on in our brain we're really not aware of, and then only afterwards we sort of make that decision of what's going on Because that way it makes sense to us. This is the work of a famous psychologist today whose name is Michael Gazzaniga. We will see him in the future also. So that's another question which we actually must deal with in psychology. The next question which we must deal with in psychology is how much are human beings similar or dissimilar? What are the differences between how much can we differentiate between one person and another? What is the difference in personalities? How do we categorize? A nice word for that is nosology. Make a nosology of pathology, right? In other words, categorize mental illness, or a nosology of personality, different types of personality traits. What about the differences between men and women? I mean, there's certainly much more differences between men and women besides just the biological and anatomical. There are differences in the way men and women think, in the way men and women talk. There the differences in the biological processes between men and women, the way the brain works. These are all questions which also differences between cultures. How much does culture influence how much the difference is between one group and another group? Remember, if you can recall, that I talked about the three levels of exploration in psychology. So the differences on each one of those particular levels are questions. So these are the questions which we are going to be looking at, and all psychology has been looking at. Again, it's nature versus nurture is question number 1. Free will versus determinism is question number 2. Accuracy versus inaccuracy is question number 3. Conscious versus unconscious processes is question number 4. And question number 5 is how much are we similar or different?